That Triathlon Show 326. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I introduce Scott Johnston. Scott is an endurance sports coach, author, and co-founder of the coaching business Uphill Athlete. The main focus of Scott and his company is coaching mountain sport athletes like mountain runners, climbers, and ski mountaineers. But Scott also has extensive background in more traditional endurance sports like swimming, cross-country skiing, and even triathlon, as we'll get into in the interview. But before we get into that, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. Precision Fuel and Hydration have a range of tools and products to help you personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so you can perform at your best. Everyone sweats differently, both in terms of sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration, so hydration strategies should be individualized accordingly, and fueling strategies will also need to be adapted based primarily on the duration and intensity of exercise or competition, as well as the athlete's ability to tolerate certain amounts and types of fuel. You can use the free online sweat test and quick carb calculator on precisionfuelandhydration.com to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs during training and racing. And you can book a free one-to-one video consultation with the team to refine your strategy. As a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products by using the code TTS22 at checkout at precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. I want to take the opportunity to talk about how I've been using one of Roka's products, the Roka Sim Buoyancy Shorts. I'll probably get some backlash for this, but for the last 2 years or more, I have been doing almost all of my swimming in these neoprene shorts. And in that time, I've improved my swim a lot. And I firmly believe that I improved more than I would have had I not been using the shorts as much as I have. Because the three main benefits that I've seen have been that, one, I've been able to swim at a higher volume and higher quality and intensity than I would have been capable otherwise. Two, I have been able to reduce the negative impact that a lot of bike and run training would have on my swimming without the shorts. And three, the shorts have allowed me to work more on my limiters rather than my weaknesses. And by that I mean that what might be a weakness for me when swimming in the pool in Speedos aren't a problem. They aren't a limiter in a race when I swim in a wetsuit. So because the shorts mimic the position of the wetsuit, I've been able to improve on those specific technical aspects that are limiting my race performance rather than ones that are limiting my pool performance in Speedos. And I was chatting with the team at Roka recently and telling them all of this, telling them how much the Sim Shorts have helped me improve. And they really wanted me to share this story on the podcast. So here it is. I'm not saying that it's the right strategy for everybody, but for me, it most certainly has been. And I think there are other triathletes out there like me where this can benefit you. So you can read all the details about the Sim Shorts on roka.com, and you can get 20% off your entire Roka order on roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Scott Johnston. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Mikhail. Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. You have an extremely interesting background in endurance sports. So can you tell the audience about yourself and about that background and what you're up to these days?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with, we'll work backwards. How about that chronologically?
Sure.
I am the co-owner of a online training platform called Uphill Athlete. And we have 2 books that we've written. One is called Training for the Uphill Athlete. And the first book we wrote was called Training for the New Alpinism, because we deal with all form of mountain sports. And we started primarily working with alpinists and mountaineers. And shortly after that book came out, we were contacted by someone people in your audience might recognize the name of, a guy named Kilian Jornet. And Kilian contacted myself and my business partner, Steve, and said, hey, this book is great. Could you guys do something like it for the running and skiing sports in the mountains as well, to convey the same information to that community? And we immediately said, yeah, that's great. And so our second book is co-authored with Kilian. And it deals with more towards the kind of sports that I think most of your audience would be more familiar with, mountain running and skiing, ski-mo racing, ski mountaineering, that sort of thing, rather than alpinism and mountaineering. And what set me up for having some authority in that realm was first that my business partner, Steve House, he was a professional climber, professional alpinist. I coached him through the bulk of his career, and he was largely considered to be the best high altitude alpinist in the world, by no less of an authority than Reinhold Messner. And the process that Steve and I used to train him was pretty unconventional. It was not how most climbers trained at that time. And it caught the attention of a lot of folks. And people began to ask Steve, how did you train to do all these amazing things? And so he was actually on a book tour with his memoir. And when people were asking this of him, and he said, well, I could tell you, but I'd have to write a book. And so that's how this process started. And we did write a book. But what had led me up to that point was in the 10 or so years that I was coaching Steve through this highly successful career as a climber were also coincided with the second half of my coaching career of cross-country ski racers. And those folks I started coaching a junior program around 2000. And I had about 120 kids in the program. And we ended up producing, 4 Olympians out of that program. And several went on to very successful results on the World Cup and Olympic podiums, that sort of thing. And I was coinciding, the second half of that, as I said, coincided with the time I was coaching Steve. Prior to that, I had been reasonably high-level athlete myself. I had competed in cross-country skiing at fairly the World Cup level, but with fairly mediocre to poor results, actually. So I wasn't a particularly good athlete myself, but it did give me a lot of exposure to the sport. At the same time, I was quite an active climber, alpinist myself, and I understood the demands of conventional endurance sport training, along with the demands of the sort of the quite unconventional sport of alpinism. And then leading into that, I had a varied career with some other type work. I have an engineering background and a mathematics background, so I'd worked in those areas. But as a younger person, I had been a swimmer and was part of an Olympic development program in swimming during my high school years, and was competed at a fairly high level, not at the Olympics, but pretty high level in that sport as well. So starting, even as a adolescent young person, I was exposed to quite high level coaching approaches and training philosophies, training theories. And so that's kind of taking me back to the beginning of my introduction to these kinds of sports. And I did have a little exposure to triathlon one year when I was training for cross-country ski racing. A friend of mine who had been third place at the Ironman race, a guy named Grant Boswell, I think he was third there in the mid 80s. And he said, "Oh, you should do triathlon." And because I had this swimming background and I obviously could run pretty well. And so Grant talked me into racing for a season as a triathlete. And so I got exposure to that sport as well. So I kind of have a broad background, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess, development arc for your endurance career from swimming, where events last anywhere from 20-something seconds, of course, if you're a sprinter, to mountaineering, where you might have done expeditions, like multi-day expeditions, or I know very little about mountaineering and what kind of mountaineering you did or climbing you did, but that's quite interesting to see how you went from the short end of the endurance spectrum to the long end as well. And that leads me into my next question, which is, can you tell us one thing or one lesson that you learned through your experience in each of your main sports that you did? So swimming, cross-country skiing, and climbing/mountaineering.
Yes, I think I can. Now, I think there's kind of an overarching theme there as well. But the first one was swimming, was that swimming makes you really mentally tough because you're staring at, in my case, the coach I was working with in this Olympic development program was an adherent of Arthur Lydiard's training. This was back in the mid to late 70s. And I'm sure many of your folks are familiar with Arthur Lydiard, but he was the first major proponent of accumulating a high volume of low intensity training. And so my coach started taking those ideas to heart and applying them to swimming. So we trained typically 5 hours a day for 6 days a week. Each day was about 20,000 meters. And so we spent 5 hours a day staring at the bottom of a pool. You have to be fairly mentally tough to do that, I think, or kind of stupid. And being a young guy and really wanting to do this, you pointed me in the right direction and I was willing to do it. But I think that really kind of toughened me up in a way. Anybody who has trained much in swimming, I think, can probably relate to that. And then when I took that, I obviously had a really good effect on my fitness base. And when I went to cross country skiing, it was very liberating because I was outdoors, either running or skiing, and it felt it was a lot more fun than being in the pool. And then the thing that I came away from with cross country skiing was to understand that often the dogma surrounding the approach to training can be wrong. And I experienced that when I started skiing at a high level and was exposed to high level coaching in cross country skiing with the U.S. ski team, that I knew from my exposure to training as a swimmer that some of these ideas that were being used in a fairly dogmatic way about this is the way it must be done didn't line up with what I knew about training. And so I began to question that. That helped me.
And what were those ideas?
Well, there was, I think we'll get into that more because I see some of your other questions that will kind of dive into that. So I'm interested in telling you a little more about it. But essentially, there was a lack of understanding about the mixture of volume, the volume of what we would call aerobic base training and intensity. That was the biggest thing that came to mind for me. And it resulted in the misuse of those ideas, or the misuse of those training philosophies resulted in a lot of young athletes, never reaching their potential.
Yeah, you're right. We'll go into that in more detail later. So we can skip ahead to your climbing lesson learned.
Yeah, so then when I took some of these ideas into climbing, I began to experiment with these ideas that I picked up in these more conventional sports, and how if I applied them to my own personal training. I wasn't being coached or anything like that, but I was saying, maybe if I should do this kind of training to help my performance in the mountains. And I began to have tremendous success with it. And certainly back in the 70s or in early 80s, not too many climbers were training. Climbers just go climbing for training. That's what they do. It's been the tradition for years. And I began to apply more of a systematic approach to my training and began to see great results with it. So when I began to coach Steve in the early 2000s, that was same kind of thing happened. I could say to Steve, first of all, I understand why we're doing these things because I have this background in these conventional sports and the conventional sport training methodologies, but I also understand how we can apply these conventional sports ideas to this unconventional sport. And so I don't know, outside the box thinking maybe is too strong a word, but it did, having the background in these other two sports proved really valuable in terms of adapting to this kind of extrapolating my current knowledge to a new situation.
Yeah. So we might not get too deep into climbing specifically, but I am very curious to hear the highlight reel, so to say, of in what way is that sort of that endurance or aerobic foundation important for climbers? And explain this to somebody that knows nothing about climbing. And also, secondly, how do you then train that part for a climber like yourself or for Steve? Like, do you use cycling or running, or what does that look like in practice?
Great question. So first of all, it's many of these when we're talking major alpine climbs, these things are going to last, from many hours to several days, often nonstop. It's not at all. Steve did a climb in a very difficult climb in Alaska that was continuous movement for 60 hours and with significant technical difficulties. So there's a need in that case for a mix of both, the strong, high aerobic capacity so that you can keep going for hours and hours, and then also some significant strength and power, and then also high technical skills, which, as you well know from training, any endurance athlete knows that when you become fatigued, the first thing that goes away is fine motor skills. Your technique begins to break down, and in climbing, you can't really afford that luxury. You don't have that luxury because you can't just. There's no do-overs. I mean, you can fall and be killed, and so maintaining being able to. You're having your fine motor skills and your cognitive abilities not degrade over long duration events is key, not just to success, but in fact, sometimes staying alive. So the importance of this, the primary importance, I think, of the aerobic base is as a support mechanism. Except in ultra long events, like we see, is more popular now for there's obviously some bicycle races that are ultra long. Many endurance running races in the mountains, especially, have gone on to 200 to 300 miles in length and take 80 plus hours to complete these. And in those type of events, the endurance base is really quite specific to the performance. But in shorter events, the endurance base is more of a support mechanism for them. So in that way, I hope I've made it sort of understandable that these, even though the intensity it's sometimes in these long duration mountaineering or alpine climbing event scenarios is rather low because you're on the move for so many hours, there are periods during that when the intensity is going to be very high for several minutes to even an hour or more. So I hope that sort of addresses that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. And I mean, I think it's a little bit analogous to some team sports, like something that I'm quite familiar with is football or soccer, and how that's definitely not an endurance sport, but still having an endurance base is important for the repeated sprint ability. That's how. So it's not per se technical, but that's a little bit analogous to what you described there, with that the endurance base acts as a support mechanism for something that is really important for performance in that sport.
And I would think even in soccer, especially if if those fine motor skills begin to degrade, I mean, it's a pretty technically demanding sport that, if the fine motor skills degrade, you're not going to play a very good, even if you have great endurance, you're not going to play a great game of football or soccer if you can't hit the ball or can't make it go where you want it to go.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that was already a very nice lead-in into your perspectives on the importance of an aerobic base and endurance performance. If we're talking about traditional endurance sports like triathlon, swimming, cycling, running, are there any other things that you think are important to mention when it comes to that aerobic base and how it matters for endurance performance?
Sure. I think it's maybe a good place to start with that is by endurance. When I think of endurance, I think of anything longer than about 2 minutes, because any event that lasts 2 minutes or longer is the energy supply is dominated by the aerobic metabolic pathway. And so even for relatively short events, having a good aerobic base becomes quite important. Obviously, if you're a 400-meter runner, it's not very important to you. But certainly to the 1,500-meter runner, even though that's an event that at a world-class level is 3.5 minutes long, it's still dominated by the aerobic metabolic pathway. And the only way that you can train this aerobic base is by training at a level that requires the maximum production of aerobic metabolism with a minimal activation of the anaerobic metabolic pathway. And so that means training at a relatively low intensity. And in order to accumulate a high volume of this type of training, you're sort of forced into training at a relatively low intensity. I mean, not too many people can, train 20 hours a week and have very much of that at a high intensity, or they will very rapidly fall into an overtraining state. So it's, and as I mentioned, especially in more conventional sports, that last, let's say, 3.5 to 4 minutes to up to 2 to 4 hours, this aerobic base that I'm talking about, which is the maximum, we think of it as aerobic capacity. So it's the capacity of the aerobic metabolic system, to produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the fuel that the muscles use for contraction. And we want to maximize the aerobic capacity while minimizing the anaerobic stimulus to the anaerobic system, so that it's sort of downregulated in this aerobic base training. The reason that that's important in all endurance sports is that I'll have to go down slightly into the weeds, but I'll try to I'm not want to bore people.
That's fine. We're used to it on this podcast.
Okay, the physiology of this, and I'm sure much of this is probably already known by your audience, but these long duration events are the propulsion that we use for the locomotion in them comes almost entirely from the slow twitch muscle fibers. And those muscle fibers are powered almost exclusively by this aerobic metabolic system. Now, the next door to these slow twitch fibers are the repository of faster twitch fibers nearby that you would need for these sprints, and you would need for to sustain, let's say, something up near your functional threshold power or your anaerobic threshold pace in running or something like that. Those things are all lying next to each other in this muscle fiber makeup of let's say the quadricep muscle or something. As many people know, the byproduct of anaerobic or glycolytic metabolism, which is what fuels those faster twitch fibers, is a product known as lactate. Some people call it lactic acid, but in reality, lactic acid doesn't really exist for more than milliseconds, because it's you're in an aqueous solution there in the body, and so the lactic acid very quickly breaks down into a hydrogen ion and the lactate sugar molecule. Well, it turns out that these slow twitch fibers that are next door to these faster twitch fibers can take up and use that otherwise relatively useless byproduct of fast twitch muscle fiber. They can take that lactate up and use it as fuel very effectively. And that was discovered in the early 80s by a man named George Brooks, and it's come to be known as the lactate shuttle, where the lactate is moved by some enzymes out of the faster twitch fibers and into adjacent slow twitch fibers, where it gets used as fuel. So, and as I'm sure all of your guests or your listeners are familiar with, an accumulation of lactate in the blood corresponds with, I don't know if it causes it, but it certainly corresponds with a reduction in force production, and you have to slow down as lactate production builds beyond a certain point. So if we can increase the size of, or increase the aerobic capacity of these slow twitch fibers, then they are able to take up more of that lactate is being produced by the faster twitch fibers nearby. And you can think of it sort of as a vacuum cleaner. And so the bigger the vacuum cleaner, the more this lactate that these slow twitch fibers can take up, which means that those faster twitch fibers can contribute more to the force production before lactate levels increase to the point where you're forced to slow down. And so that's why I was saying in these conventional sports, the aerobic base training is essentially a support mechanism for more sport-specific type intensity training or intensity in races. So let's say in an international length triathlon, you're not going to be doing any of your racing at this low intensity aerobic base training level. And so that's where it becomes counterintuitive. Some people will say, well, why should I train this aerobic base? I'm never racing there. Well, the reason you should train it is you want to increase the size of that vacuum cleaner so that when you're in your race and those fast twitch fibers are producing lactate, there's some place for that lactate to go and be used. So that's sort of my take on understanding why this aerobic base training is important and where it fits into the training, even for relatively short events. Like the 1,500 meters. That'd be a perfect example.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation, and I think that the lactate explanations that you gave there as well, they are really nice, and they show what happens under the hood when we, for example, do 2 lactate tests separated by a few months of training, and we see an improvement. We see, for example, less lactate for a certain power or a certain pace. That doesn't necessarily mean that less lactate is produced. There might be as much or even more lactate produced, but you have managed to improve your slow twitch fibers' ability to uptake that lactate and use it as fuel. So you see less of it as concentration in the blood. So that's an important distinction there, and that just enhances your endurance capacity. One follow-up question that I have on what you said is regarding how easy you should do this base training and why. So do you think that the reason to train at a low intensity is simply so that you can do a lot of it, and that's the best way to maximize your aerobic fitness and your slow twitch fibers? Or you also mentioned there downregulating the anaerobic contribution. Is that an important part of it? Can you explain a little bit more around why the intensity control there is important?
Sure. I think those are 2 separate questions. So just the second one first is, I believe that all endurance athletes, even the multi-hour, although it's less important for the person who's doing a 100-mile race, but all endurance athletes need to elevate both their aerobic and anaerobic capacities. And this is especially true in relatively short events. And this would, again, relating back to something like the 800 meters or the 1,500 meters, it's very important in those events. Or, as you and I were talking before we started recording, the cross-country ski sprint event, where it's super important that the athlete has both an exceptionally high aerobic capacity, but they also need to have a very high anaerobic capacity. And but the confusion, I think, comes for many people that those are 2 completely different metabolic systems, and they respond to different training stimuli. And so you need to understand what you're training for, what kind of effect you're looking for with this specific training session. Now, back to your first question with regards to the duration of training, the biggest stimulus to increase, any kind of training stimulus, is the volume of training. And because these slow twitch fibers have a lot of endurance in them, they require a stimulus that will fatigue them in order for them to make adaptations. But that stimulus might have to last for several hours in some cases, depending on the fitness of the athlete. Whereas this training stimulus for the anaerobic or the faster twitch fibers, that comes mostly from the intensity of the activity. And although duration is important in that, we can get into that later. But so duration is important always, but in aerobic base training, it's critical that the volume is high enough to create this aerobic-based training stimulus. So you improve that way. How high that is or how much volume it is, I mean, I think your audience certainly understands that the reason that high-level marathon runners run 100 miles a week and sometimes much more is that that's what they need to do in order to get that training stimulus. And you could say the same thing about professional bicycle racers who are training for multi-day events. They put in a huge volume of relatively easy riding because that's what they need to do in order to stimulate in order to increase the size of that vacuum cleaner that I was talking about earlier. And so that's why I think that's where volume really comes into play. And it's the reason that endurance athletes, and especially long distance endurance athletes, train in some cases kind of a ridiculously high volume. Does that answer that, or did I leave something out?
Yep, that makes sense. But then the other part was the dimension that you made of downregulating the anaerobic metabolism during this training. And how does that play in with also what you said, that you want a high anaerobic capacity in the end?
That's where training gets really difficult. And it's great to have these theories that I think we understand reasonably well. But it's important to understand that when you train either one of these systems to upregulate the aerobic system, let's say, it will downregulate the anaerobic system and vice versa. You train too much anaerobic work, you're going to downregulate the aerobic system. And trying to achieve that balance is an incredibly difficult and delicate process. And of course, it's different for different sports. And the recovery time between training sessions, it becomes really important. But essentially what I've had, I have seen ways that you can, and I usually use a sort of a block training system when I'm trying to do this with, let's say, a middle distance runner or a cross-country ski sprinter, where we'll have a block of training that maybe is 2 to 3 or 4 weeks long, where the emphasis is on one of these systems. And the training emphasis on the other system drops down to more of a maintenance level so that we can return to that system in the next block of training. And we cycle that way. And so, yes, there is some downregulation of the non-primary system that's being trained during that block, but we hope to not completely destroy it so that when we return to that, stimulus for that system, we can. What I've seen seems to happen as kind of a stair-step approach. You're in one block, the aerobic system's getting stronger, and we try to minimize the damage to the anaerobic system, and then the whole situation reverses in the next block of training. And so it's where coaching, I think, becomes more art than science, and requires a very close communication with the athlete and monitoring of their performance. And if you begin to see let's say a significant drop off in aerobic capacity or anaerobic capacity, you need to be able to take some action to mitigate that, so that you don't want to push one down too far, and especially the aerobic one, because it is possible for an endurance athlete to have too much anaerobic capacity, but it is not possible to have too much aerobic capacity. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And we'll get into some more specifics around examples of training structure in a little bit. First, can you define the term aerobic deficiency syndrome that I know that you use in your books and on your blogs and so on?
Sure. And I can't take credit for coining that term. Someone also that your audience might be familiar with is Phil Maffetone. And Phil and I go back quite a long time. I worked with him as a coach in the early 80s, actually, with him giving me some coaching advice. But he came up with this term of aerobic deficiency syndrome. And basically what it means is your vacuum cleaner is too small for the level of anaerobic work that you're trying to perform. And so you need to there's some proactive steps you could take to to decrease or eliminate this aerobic deficiency syndrome. But it's surprising how many, and even quite high level athletes, world-class athletes that I've worked with who have come to me who are aerobically deficient. And I know that sounds kind of shocking to think that somebody who specializes in, let's say, a 50-kilometer cross-country ski race and competes at the World Cup could be aerobically deficient. But it has happened. I've seen it frequently, and certainly in the recreational amateur athlete realm, I see it. I would guess 80 to 90% of the people that come to us for coaching are aerobically deficient, and so we need to first fix that problem. Because until we get the vacuum cleaner of adequate size, none of this other stuff makes very much difference. It's not, you can't just focus in on improving the glycolytic or anaerobic capacity until you have an adequate aerobic base or adequate aerobic capacity. So that's sort of the long and short of this aerobic deficiency syndrome. I know it sounds dangerous and desperate, but I mean, if you're an athlete, it is kind of a bad thing to have.
Yeah, that's a good definition. And how do you assess that when you get new athletes coming on board? What is the measurements that you use to test whether an athlete is aerobically deficient or not?
Well, there's several methods, and all the way from using a gas analysis, gas exchange test on a treadmill. That can be a good way of doing this, and all the way to a blood lactate test, like you were mentioning, lactate test. That can be another very good way to assess the aerobic capacity. And then finally, there's a tool that we use that relies on collecting careful GPS and heart rate data over a prescribed running distance. In our case, we usually use it running. That compares how much, if let's say you're going to run for an hour and hold the pace steady. How much does your heart rate increase over that 1 hour run? And the amount of increase in that heart rate at a steady pace is an indicator of that aerobic base capacity. So there's three pretty distinct ways that it can be done. The self-administered test actually has anyone and I would assume a great deal of your number of your audience use Training Peaks as a platform for recording their training.
Yep.
And Training Peaks has a metric for this. They auto calculation metric that they collect, which is their pace to heart rate ratio. And in the old days, when I was an athlete, we would call this heart rate drift. And so I still use that term because it's close to my heart, and that's what I learned. Training Peaks calls it heart rate, decoupling heart rate, decoupling between the pace and the heart rate. And the way we can, in any of these cases, what we're trying to do is, in whether it's with this self-administered heart rate drift test, a blood lactate test, or a gas analysis on a treadmill or a stationary bike, would be to determine what is the maximum intensity that you can sustain. And that intensity could be measured by, running pace, heart rate, power on a bicycle, any one of those things. It gives a good measure of intensity. What's the maximum intensity that you can sustain for a long period of time at before the anaerobic system begins to have to kick in to make up for deficits in the aerobic capacity's ability to produce that all-important molecule called ATP. And that maximum intensity has a number of different terms depending on where you are in the world and what journals you've read or what kind of coaching system you're under. It's historically often been called the aerobic threshold because it's the maximum amount of power or pace that your aerobic system can produce ATP for before you have to start relying more than usually 50% is the common thing on the anaerobic system. 50% of the ATP be coming from the anaerobic system. And it's also sometimes called the first lactate threshold. It's sometimes called the first ventilatory threshold. It's got several other names that I think we don't want to confuse people with, but basically it's where the anaerobic system begins to dominate ATP production. And it's usually for people with aerobic deficiency syndrome, this can be at a shockingly low pace, heart rate, or intensity. And that people will be shocked by that because they'll say, wait a minute, I feel just fine. There's no problem here. Why am I having to run so slowly to stay in this aerobic intensity zone? And the reason you're having to run that slowly is that's all the ATP that your aerobic metabolic pathway is able to produce before it needs to call in the cavalry, the anaerobic system to make up the deficit in ATP production from ATP demand. So I guess, I don't know, I don't want to go too far down this without stopping and asking if I'm on the right track.
It makes, no, you're on the right track. Exactly. And I guess what you would then have to do is kind of look at the athlete's performances and compare that to where you find their aerobic threshold or LT1 sits. And so let's say you have a really good miler, let's say a 4-minute miler, but you find that their aerobic threshold sits at 6:20 per mile or something, which would be quite low for that level of runner, or very low for that level of runner. Then you would know that, okay, we have an issue here, that this athlete has strong performance, but the aerobic system is not. If we want to improve, we're going to have to improve the aerobic system, and so you would have to relate, because obviously athletes of different levels would have different. They might not be aerobically deficient depending on what their performance says. So you have to compare that to their aerobic threshold to their performance, if that makes sense. Am I on the right track with that?
No, absolutely. And that's where it can be difficult. You're working with a high level athlete who does have quite good performance, but then you discover that they're aerobically deficient. And what you're going to have to ask them to do is take 2 steps backwards to correct this aerobic deficiency. And they're not going to like hearing that they need to slow down in order to get faster. And I don't know if you recall, I just mentioned a few minutes ago about someone skiing a 50-kilometer cross-country ski race, which takes a bit over 2 hours usually. I had just such a situation arise where a fellow who was within a remarkably high max VO2, 92 milliliters. And he came to me and his performance had stagnated. He was not competitive on the World Cup. He was quite reasonably competitive on a national level, but not competitive on a World Cup. And first thing I did was do an aerobic threshold test with him. And we did it running. And I'm going to speak in minutes per mile because that's what I'm more familiar with. But the first time we did an aerobic threshold test was we found that his aerobic threshold heart rate was about 135. Now, this is a young, healthy male. And so 135 was the maximum intense heart rate he could achieve to stay in this aerobic zone. And the running pace was about 8.5 minutes per mile. And when I told him, I said, well, this right there, your vacuum cleaner is not big enough. He was able to perform at a reasonably high level because he had this huge aerobic power, but he couldn't sustain that power output for very long because his vacuum cleaner was too small. So we went to this sort of what I would call remedial training, where we had to do all this aerobic base training. And he said he was kind of a big shot in the area that he lived because he had been to some Olympics and that sort of thing. And but he said, I have to run with a bag over my head. I'm so embarrassed that I'm running this slowly outdoors, and people are going to wonder why the heck I'm what's wrong with me. About 4 months later, we did a follow-up aerobic threshold test, and his aerobic threshold heart rate had moved from 135 to 165, and his aerobic threshold running pace had dropped from 8.5 minute miles to 6:15 miles. So now I thought, okay, we've kind of fixed this aerobic deficit problem. We got the vacuum cleaner big enough. Now we can start layering on the intensity. But he had a training diet of too much high intensity, not coupled with enough low intensity in the past. And that's what had caused this out of balance. The anaerobic system was too dominant. And he went on to even better and better performance after that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And for the metric listeners, I just did the conversion. So he went from around 5:15 minutes per kilometer for his aerobic threshold to about 3 minutes 50 per kilometer. So a huge difference. Well, then let's get into some more. I think you've already given some great examples here that already kind of illustrate the point a little bit. But what are the main points that you would make for the listeners when it comes to how to do quote unquote aerobic base training? Can you discuss that a little bit more and give some tips and tricks?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's important to establish this upper limit of this intensity zone that kind of what we call this aerobic threshold, whether with one of these types of tests that we've already talked about. And then it's important to understand that you can only nudge the aerobic capacity up from below. So let's say in this guy's case, his heart rate was 135. If he needed to do his training in that 130 to 135 heart rate zone, it needs to be kind of, like I said, gently nudged up from below. You can't drag it up from above. So if he did his training at 150, that would not increase the aerobic capacity or increase that aerobic base or threshold. It would, in fact, push it down. And so this is where it becomes difficult for, especially if athletes have been fairly successful. It feels very remedial to have to go back to this. Ways to regulate that, if you haven't done a test like these tests we've talked about, I think the simplest way to assess whether you are in this aerobic zone is, can you carry on a conversation with complete sentences? If you can't, you are almost undoubtedly above your aerobic threshold. And so that can be a very easy self-check. Maybe if you're running by yourself or cycling by yourself, you have to talk to yourself a little bit. But, if you're training with a partner, it's easy. If you can carry on that conversation, you're getting an aerobic-based training effect from that. And obviously, more sophisticated measurements from these tests could allow you, and I'm sure many of the people in your audience use heart rate monitors and power meters and that sort of thing. And so you could actually quantify it much more closely by with those methods than doing something as crude as conversational pace. And some people will even use, and I've used it myself, is nose breathing. The upper limit of nose breathing tends to correlate very closely to this aerobic threshold we're talking about.
Yeah, those are some great tips, and also we'll link to the article, because you have an article on your website with the heart rate drift test. So it's fairly easy to execute. So I'll put a link in the show notes so listeners can go and have a look at that, and then they can self-test in a quantitative manner if they should desire. When you do, what about the balance between, you mentioned already a few bits and pieces there about including some maintenance, high intensity, even when focusing on the aerobic side of things. Can you explain a bit more about what that might look like in a training week, and also what the balance over the course of a year, for example, is between focusing on the aerobic metabolism versus the higher intensity and the anaerobic metabolism?
Sure. I think the most fundamental thing to understand with endurance training is that the high intensity training is a supplement to, not a replacement for, this low intensity training. And that's something I think that has been misleadingly presented in a lot of the popular press and media, is that, I only have 30 minutes to train today, so I'm just going to go out and do this, I'm going to go and run as hard as I can for 30 minutes. And while that's a beneficial training tool, it's not improving your aerobic capacity, because you're probably training well above your aerobic threshold when you do that. And so people have been I think in some ways, misled to believe that, I'm going to get the same training effect, but I can get it in a shorter period of time. And our physiology just does not work that way. I mean, there's a reason, as we pointed out before, that the best marathoners, are often training 100 plus miles a week. And so I think that that's the first important thing to gather and understand, is that the aerobic training for endurance is a high volume of quite low intensity, capped off or sprinkled in with a small volume of quite high intensity. And because these two systems, as we've talked about, need different stimuli. Now, how much, perhaps some of your listeners are familiar with Stephen Seiler's work, a physiologist that's based out of Norway. And Stephen Seiler's done some metadata studies on very successful, world-class and world champion level endurance athletes from the sports of swimming, running, cycling, cross-country skiing, and I think and rowing as well, and looked at this and said, what's the mix of intensity? Or I think he calls it the intensity distribution for very successful endurance athletes. And some of you probably have heard of this 80-20 rule. There's been even books written about the 80-20 rule. I think it's a little bit of a misunderstanding, but what Seiler came up with in this data study was that these most successful endurance athletes, about 80% of their training was done in this aerobic zone. And by that, I mean 80% of their training sessions were completed in this aerobic-based training zone. And that about 20% were in 20% of the training sessions were completed in this anaerobic. Had their purpose of that training session was to work this high intensity area. So but the real takeaway, if you read between the lines of that study, and in subsequent studies he's talked more about this, is that it turns out that in terms of total training volume, training time, about 90% of the training was done in this aerobic base zone, and only about 10% of the training time was done in the higher intensity training zones. And that's, I think, for many people, a bit of a shock, that it's that little stimulus is enough to improve the overall performance of the athlete. That little stimulus to the anaerobic system can make a huge difference. And so I think that's an important thing for people to understand, is that, that's why endurance training can be rather boring. There's just a whole lot of low intensity work that's needed to be done. And then you sprinkle in a little bit of the more fun, sexy type training into it. So that's, I guess, how I think of the intensity distribution. And what he found with the world-class athletes is this intensity distribution tended to remain fairly consistent year-round. There were obviously, during the competitive season, there would be a little more intensity into their training because of depending on how much they raced. But even, in the build up to their competitive season, there wasn't an excessive use of high intensity training by these athletes. And that's certainly been my experience with world-class cross-country skiers that I've trained, is that it just doesn't take that much stimulus. If the vacuum planer is big, then a little stimulus to that anaerobic system goes a very long way.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I think one thing that I want to clarify in terms of definitions here, when you talked about improving the aerobic capacity with the low intensity training, listeners will be very familiar with different studies on interval training, for example, and how they improve VO2 max with this many percent or that many percent. So when you talk about improving aerobic capacity exclusively with low intensity training, the way I understand it is more, it's your endurance performance capacity, or perhaps even your ability to maintain a certain high percentage of your VO2 max for a prolonged duration. Is that correct, or did I get that wrong? That's
certainly the way I understand it. I think of So I think I make a slightly different distinction, and I didn't again think of this myself. I got it from a Dutch swimming coach and physiologist named Jan Albrecht, who's written a book called The Science of Winning. And if you really want to know about lactate dynamics, this is the book for you. Not easy to get a hold of. I think it's only distributed by one place out of the UK that I could find. But anyway, he makes a very important distinction between aerobic capacity and aerobic power. Now, aerobic power is what we think of as max VO2. And I mean, that's one way to measure the maximum aerobic power, is doing a max VO2 test. Aerobic capacity, on the other hand, is, like I mentioned before, the maximum intensity that you can sustain while the aerobic system is the dominant production mechanism for producing that ATP. Now, when you're up in the higher intensity zones where you could produce maximum max VO2, then you're going to be getting a significant contribution of the energy coming from that anaerobic system, which is why you can't sustain that max VO2 effort for more than just a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Any longer than that, and the intensity will have to drop down because it's not sustainable. Which is one of the reasons that max VO2 does not correlate particularly well with endurance performance. What correlates well with endurance performance, as you just alluded to, is what percentage of that max VO2 can you sustain for a long duration? And that's indicated usually in a test. That would be indicated by, let's say, what we call the anaerobic threshold, or the second lactate threshold, or the second ventilatory threshold. Again, there's the maximum lactate steady state. That's the aerobic threshold. Maximum lactate steady state would be another indication or a measurement of that maximum percentage of your max VO2 that you can produce. And that is highly correlated with endurance performance. So and again, this is where that aerobic system, the vacuum cleaner, plays this critical supporting role, is it allows you to sustain a higher percentage of your max VO2 for a longer period of time. And so what we would like to do through our training is, like I mentioned with that skier, elevate the aerobic threshold up to as high an intensity as we can get it, so that it's close to that anaerobic threshold, which in turn is close to your maximum, either heart rate or maximum power output. We want those upper zones, intensity zones, to be squeezed down to, in some cases, I've had World Cup cross-country skiers where that middle zone, what we make, our zone system, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about that. Maybe this is a time to segue into that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so
I'll just chime in with a comment there. That all makes perfect sense, and thank you. That's exactly what I was asking about. The only comment that I have there is that I do think that Jan Olbrecht defines the terms in the opposite way that you described. So aerobic capacity would be your max VO2, and aerobic power would be the percentage of VO2 you can hold, or your ability to hold that.
Okay, excuse me. It's been a number of years since I read his book. So yeah.
He's a past guest on the podcast, and so is Steven Seiler.
Okay.
So I'll put the links to those interviews in the show notes as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that correction.
Yeah. So let's segue into the zones then. And you were saying there about the difference between between the first and the second lactate threshold, and that's what you were starting to talk about.
Yes. So this distance between the first and second lactate thresholds, we would like, what seems to happen with very successful endurance athletes is that the distance between those two, measured in intensity or heart rate, is minimized. And in some cases, I have seen that gap. Typically, I like to see it below 10%. Before I think, okay, this person has a good enough aerobic capacity that we're probably not going to increase that much more, at least in this training cycle. But I have seen it as low as 6% in one World Cup cross-country skier. And so when you think of 6% with let's say 180 heart rate, we're talking just, what's that, about 10 beats.
Yeah.
10 heart rate beats. So it's a very narrow distance between these two. One of the interesting things that comes from that is when an athlete has this very high aerobic threshold, then they shouldn't, and they would be unwise to do a lot of their training up near that aerobic threshold, because it's too close to the anaerobic threshold. Even though metabolically they are in an aerobic state, neuromuscularly it's very demanding on them. And I think a good real world example of this is someone like Eliud Kipchoge, who has broken 2 hours in the marathon. His aerobic threshold in the marathon is an event that's competed at or quite close to one's aerobic threshold. So his aerobic threshold pace is around, what's that, 4.5 minute miles. What's that calculate to in kilometers per hour?
The world record pace was about 2:52 per kilometer, I think, when the sub 2 hours.
Yeah, so it's under 3 minutes per kilometer. Yeah. And so even though metabolically he's in an predominantly aerobic state, neuromuscularly, running that fast takes a huge toll on your nervous system and on the muscles themselves. And if an athlete, a high-level athlete, trains very much at that intensity, they will, again, run a significant risk of overtraining or injury. So the fitter the athlete, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, the fitter the athlete, the more polarized, that's a term, as you know, that Seiler has used that I think is a great way of thinking of it. But the fitter the athlete, the more polarized the training needs to be. So there needs to be a bigger spread, but the easy days need to be quite easy so that the hard days can be hard.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And training too much in the middle training too much in the middle is a rather dangerous place for the very fit athlete. Whereas someone who is aerobically deficient would need to train a lot up close to that aerobic threshold.
Yeah, but which, as you pointed out, still will, for many recreational athletes anyway, will feel very easy. So in terms of feeling, it's still a low intensity, but in terms of your percentage of aerobic threshold, you're very close to it compared to the elite, like Eliud Kipchoge type person. Going into there was one follow-up I had on that, I think. It'll come to me if it comes to me. But no, actually, now I remember. So running is obviously a great example with the neuromuscular demands, as you mentioned. But even in non-weight-bearing sports like cycling, if you have a very high aerobic threshold, then even just the caloric demands of riding there would be so high that you can easily overtrain, even though you're at that low intensity, relatively speaking. So that's why cyclists would do the same. They wouldn't go out and do 6 hours day in, day out at their aerobic threshold, because that's just way too hard. They're way below that.
Exactly. Yeah. Completely agree.
So now then, let's get into training zones and testing. So where do you want to start? I mean, the two go hand in hand. So what do you think makes the most sense to start with?
I think that training needs to be individualized to the needs of the athlete. So it's one of the reasons that, just grabbing a stock training plan from somewhere on the internet or looking at, this is what the latest, this is what so-and-so, this is what Eliud Kipchoge did for the last 6 months of his training. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'm sure I will have the best marathon of my life. That's a huge mistake, because Eliud Kipchoge's training obviously was individualized for his needs, not yours. So if you were aerobically deficient, you would be doing an entirely different kind of training. So I like to start all of the training I'm with, as I mentioned with that cross-country skier, the 50-kilometer guy, we need to establish these zones with you through some form of testing, so that we know what your metabolic response to exercise is first. And once we know that, then we can start shaping the training around it. I mean, are you aerobically deficient? Do we need to have a lot of training to fix that problem first? Or are you aerobically very fit, like this guy that I mentioned, whose the spread between the two thresholds was only a few beats, less than 10 beats? Those two athletes need very different kinds of training. And it also means that training in a group can be dangerous so if I sent those two guys that I just mentioned, if I sent them out and told them to do the same kind of training, they were going to get completely different training effects from it. And so I think it's what I see often at the collegiate level or club level, where people go out and train together, is that the person who's perhaps leading the pace is in the correct training zone. They are, let's say it's an easy bike ride or an easy run. The one who's out in front probably is training properly, but the ones who don't have that kind of aerobic power, they would be struggling because they would be in a much higher intensity zone. And so they're not getting the training stimulus that the coach probably would like to see them get, or that they think they're getting. And those people will also, again, like we've talked about several times, they'll run a significant risk of becoming overtrained because they're doing the wrong kind of training stimulus too much. So this idea of establishing a baseline from which the athlete, so that the coach and the athlete understand where they're starting from, that allows you to make a roadmap to where we're going from here. How are we going to get there? And I think that's my first, like I said, rule number one. And then once we do that, we can start to sprinkle in intensity where it's needed, when it's needed. And again, that's very different for different athletes. And there's a lot of different ways to add intensity. You're probably understand or familiar with Per Ostrand's famous quote from his book in 1970, I think it was, that he wrote about. It's about, I don't remember the name of the book, but it's Physiology of Endurance. And he said at that time, it's not clear what kind of intensity training. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. He actually is much more specific in that, but it's not clear what kind of high intensity training is the best stimulus. And despite studies that have been done subsequent to that, in the intervening, what's that been, 50 years now, I think it's still not completely clear what type of high intensity training is best. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's so much variation. I mean, this aerobic base training, everybody understands how you do that, or anybody who knows about it understands how it's done. It's quite simple. But when it comes to adding intensity, is it better to do very short, very high intensity training, or is it better to do long duration, what we might call in running tempo training, or right around that functional threshold power in cycling? Which one is best? And I've read studies, and one that Seiler completed just a couple of years ago that would indicate maybe a slightly different take on that. They did the study with these Norwegian cross-country skiers to try to determine which was the most effective training, their intensity method with them, using 4 minutes, 6 minute, and I believe 8 minute.
4, 8, 16, I believe.
Duration repetitions.
4 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, and 16 minutes, I think were the different.
16 years, excuse me, you're right, yeah. And what they came up with, which I think is really valuable information and useful to have, but these were already very successful, very highly developed endurance athletes that they were applying this to. And once again, that isn't very individualized to the need of the athlete. I mean, I know for a fact, because I've seen this happen over and over again in skiing, where when this idea that the length of the repetition should be about 8 minutes long. If you take a 17-year-old cross-country skier and you tell them to ski as hard as they can for 7 or 8 minutes, then their second or third or fourth repetition is just the speed and the power output is going to degrade so fast because they don't have the local muscular endurance to maintain that kind of power output for that long. Whereas if you have a 28-year-old cross-country skier that's been skiing on the World Cup for a dozen years or 10 years, whatever, they do have that muscular endurance. And so they're going to get tremendous benefits from this, 4 by 8 minute type routine. So I think that's the importance of understanding the athlete and understanding the where they are in their physiological development.
Yeah, I would agree with that we really don't know. And there are lots of, rules of thumb for if you have this kind of athlete, then those sorts of intervals might be better, or those sorts. But in terms of hard facts, we have still very little, and everybody needs to kind of cook their own meal in terms of what science they read and buy into, and at the end of the day, it comes down to experimenting, I think, and see what works for the individual athlete. Of course, with a good amount of knowledge, you can have a better chance of guessing right the first time around, but it's still only going to be an educated guess at the end of the day with the intensity, I think.
And I think that's why you see such a huge variation in different coaches and different athletes' approaches to adding intensity, because no one's completely sure. And I think the most common approach for most coaches is we're going to sprinkle in some of everything and hope that we're, getting it right. Some of these, quite short, super high intensity, and others, long duration, like 16-minute repetitions. I think that that's the reason there's that big range, and then eventually you will find out which type you seem to respond best to. But just because you hear that so and so succeeded by doing this particular interval protocol for 6 weeks doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work for everybody.
Yeah. What's your general take if you have somebody comes off the street and they're training for a marathon, an amateur athlete? Do you have a sense of what you might give as your first and best guess for what they need to do? Do you have, for example, do you do what quite a few coaches do in terms of doing more and more specific intensity closer to the race? So you might do harder and shorter intervals further out, and then longer and more race pace like intervals closer to race, or any rules of thumb that you follow?
Yes, I think that, first of all, I think that your high intensity training should in many ways mimic the demands of the event as closely as possible. So, for instance, someone who's training for cycling would not probably get at appropriate benefits by doing, their interval training in a pool. Triathletes, of course, this is much more complex for them because they have 3 different sports that they're competing in. But I think that if the maximum benefits are going to come from your high intensity training looking a lot like the event you're training for. I like you suggested, especially for something like a marathon, I like to start off with very short, with long rest interval, higher intensity runs. We started off with strides, 15-second strides during a regular easy run, to try to condition the connective tissue to the impact loading, and to try to kind of wake up those faster twitch fibers that we're later going to become, start using more and more. And then through a process of progression, we can move from that to, longer and longer intervals. And then, obviously for me, the kind of my go-to for many distance runners are either kilometer or mile repeats. For people competing in events, longer than, let's say a half marathon, had good success with that. As kind of just if you got to do something, let's do mile repeats or kilometer repeats, and make sure you can handle this. Also, those help people develop an understanding of what the pace they should be running at is. So someone's going to try to run a 3-hour marathon, we would make those kilometer or mile repeats at that goal pace. And in the beginning, we might have to have really long rests between those repetitions so they could recover and maintain that pace. But then as we get closer and closer to the event, and hopefully their endurance capacities improved, then we would be able to shorten the recovery time between those repetitions.
Yeah. Makes sense. I think that was great. We got sidetracked a bit from the zones and testing, but that was a great discussion to have.
Sorry.
No worries. So let's. We talked about how it's important that you have that sort of individual initial testing to establish a bit of a roadmap. And let's talk about the ways. You mentioned them, you listed them off already, but can you maybe describe the pros and cons of the different testing methods that you use, and perhaps give some recommendations what might suit whom?
Sure. Well, we've talked a little bit about these. I think that we can add a few more into that. But the aerobic threshold determination, which for me is ground zero, that has to be done before anything else, because if you don't have a big enough vacuum cleaner, like I said, none of this other stuff is going to make very much difference. So we can establish that by going to a laboratory, getting on a treadmill or a stationary bike, and doing what not a max VO2 test. And this is one of the problems. This is one of the pitfalls of going to a lab that advertises max VO2 testing, is that they pass through those low intensity zones during the test. So these tests are graded step tests where you increase the intensity every, sometimes I've seen it as short as 15 seconds, but hopefully it's more up in the 2 to 3 minute range, increase intensity in steps. But the problem with something like a max VO2 test is they usually are in a hurry to get you up to that maximum intensity you can sustain, so they don't tire you out and have you not be able to produce your maximum power. So they'll rush through these low intensity zones in a way that you can sometimes pick out that aerobic threshold from the data, but it's not very easy. And I think it becomes misleading because you're transitioning through this aerobic zone so fast. And the aerobic metabolism is it's quite slow to respond to changes in intensity. So if you don't have several minutes at that intensity, you're going to blow through that aerobic zone testing area so fast that you just won't get an adequate picture. So the type of test that you want is often called a metabolic efficiency test, and there aren't that many places that administer it. But you want a test that might take 45 minutes to an hour, and most people can't stay on a treadmill that long and still produce their max VO2 at the end of that. That's why is setting yourself up for a max VO2 test in many cases will not provide you the result that we need for that aerobic threshold. So you'd want to make sure that another reason you don't want to do a max VO2 test to determine your aerobic threshold is in order to produce your maximum power output aerobically, you would need to be well fueled and have your muscle glycogen stores would need to be topped up and really brought up to maximum ability, so because that glycogen is going to be what you need to produce that maximum power. Whereas for the aerobic threshold, we often always ask people to do this in a fasted state, because we would like to see how much of the energy you can produce can come from fat and with minimal from the glycolytic system. So if you do that, if you go into a max VO2 test in a fasted state, you will not see your max VO2. So these are two different types of tests. And I think that's one of the confounding issues. And these tests are also very expensive. You can spend several $100s in order to find this out. The blood lactate test is a good way to establish the aerobic threshold. And we don't need to go into it. Because a lab technician would probably be able to tell you how it's done, but generally you're measuring the first significant rise in blood lactate to determine where that first lactate threshold or aerobic threshold occurs. That can, a skilled person can perform that test and give you a pretty darn good idea.
There's a very recent website, xphyslab.com, that has a free lactate thresholds app within it, where you can just add your own lactate data, and it uses all sorts of methods. So you can use the Dmax method and rise above baseline methods and OBLA and all of that. So that's a cool resource for people want to do their own lactate testing.
That's great to know. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I don't use lactate testing as much as I did. I used to use it when I was coaching skiers, because I'd be on the ground with them or on the snow with them, and we could test during training. But I don't use that very much anymore. And it's easy, self-administering lactate tests. It's easy to screw them up, and I don't normally recommend them to most people. these ventilatory markers that I talked about before, either nose breathing or conversational pace, those are something very easy, very low tech, give you really good idea of where that aerobic threshold is. This heart rate drift test, I think we've seen now remarkable correlation between the accuracy of the heart rate drift test when compared to a good metabolic efficiency test, gas exchange test on a treadmill. So more and more, I push people in the direction of this heart rate drift test because it seems to work very well. And it's one you can administer yourself again for free. Every few weeks, if you're seeing an improvement in performance, you can redo your aerobic threshold test. So maybe we should jump to the second threshold, the second lactate threshold, or the anaerobic threshold. I'm not as big a fan of trying to determine that either with a gas exchange test or with a blood lactate test. And the reason for that is, once again, you're transitioning through that intensity zone for maybe 3 minutes at the most. My preference is to do those tests in the field with sort of a time trial effort. So if you want to determine, let's say, how fast can I run for an extended period of time? Maybe it's 30 minutes. You decide you want to use 30 minutes. For a world-class athlete, I usually do an hour-long anaerobic or second lactate threshold test. So it's an hour-long time trial in a sport-specific way, as close to their event as I can make it. So in summer skiing for cross-country skiers, they might be on roller skis. And then we take the average heart rate for my skiers. We would take that, because heart rate is kind of the metric we're forced to use. We don't have another good way of measuring intensity than heart rate. So we would take the average heart rate that they could sustain for that hour, or for a less well-trained person, maybe 30 minutes or something in between for a person who's trained in between those levels. And we say, okay, that average heart rate is sort of the maximum power output you can sustain for this extended period. Now, on a bicycle would be similar, but you could do it by heart rate. But luckily, bicycles, you can also measure power. And so this is where we come up with that concept of the functional threshold power, but it's similar to this idea that we're talking about. And so I prefer to find this second threshold using a sport-specific field test rather than because in these other tests, we're measuring a proxy for that intensity. We're measuring either blood lactate or respiratory exchange ratio or something like that. Whereas in this field test, we're actually measuring the thing, and we're seeing that thing, not a proxy for the thing.
Yeah, as Andy Coggan famously said, the best measure of performance is performance itself.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
yes.
That goes great along those lines. And then when you have your aerobic threshold and your anaerobic threshold established, how do you set their zones? I know because I read it on your website, but can you explain that to the listeners?
Sure. I like to keep it very simple, and this is something that came to me from cross-country skiing. When I was competitive in ski racing, the first polar heart rate monitors came out, and they were huge devices. They were on your wrist, but they were big and clunky, and we were excited to have some way of actually monitoring intensity. And I met with one of you're being Finnish, you have I'm sure some knowledge of polar and all that, but I met when they began to bring them over into this country, and they first gave them to the U.S. ski team, and I got one. We met with one of the representatives from Polar, a Finnish man, and he said that they had set their zones up in this fashion. And I know this sounds pretty crude, but I think it makes some intuitive sense now that I look back on it all these years later. They called zone 1 millimole. At the top of zone 1 was where you're making about 1 millimole of blood lactate. The top of zone 2 was where you're making about 2 millimoles of blood lactate. And likewise for the top of zone 3. And basically zone 4 was just hard. Anything above 4 millimoles was hard. And So I've used that very simple 4-zone system ever since then. I know that Steven Seiler and the Norwegians often use a 3-zone system, which I think is also really good. I think parsing intensity zones down into, I've seen as much as 7 zones. I think that's sort of false precision in my book. Yeah, maybe you can measure that stuff, but telling an athlete when this intensity zone is only 10 watts wide or 5 heart rate beats wide, it's impossible to control your intensity that closely during actual training. So I still use a very simple system, and and I think it fits up well with the one that Steven Seiler uses, which is the aerobic threshold would be the top of what we call zone 2. And the anaerobic, or the second lactate threshold, would be the top of what we call zone 3. And then everything above that would be zone 4. And when we talk about, I don't see much use for a zone 5 or above in terms of intensity, because in order to get that kind of maximal intensity, heart rate does not become a useful measure, because your heart rate doesn't respond to, it doesn't show the same things, the same kind of correlation with intensity as it does in longer duration. Let's say if you're doing zone 4 intervals for 4 or 5 minutes at a time, heart rate will be able to stabilize and will indicate that intensity pretty closely. Whereas if you are doing 30-second uphill running sprints, your heart rate isn't as important as the effort. It doesn't represent the effort. And what I tell people when we're doing these short of intervals is you're just going to go as hard as you can for that 30 seconds, as such that you can repeat it over and over again, of course. So I keep it really simple like that. And my zone 1 would be often, like what people would call a recovery state, or for these very high level athletes, that would be where they do a lot of their aerobic base training. And for me, I've taken a very arbitrary measure that it's about 10% below, in terms of heart rate or power or running pace, about 10% below what we determine through this testing to be the aerobic threshold. So that's sort of my system. I like to keep it pretty darn simple. And I think Seiler's use of the 3-zone system is even better because it's so simple. But I like to give people something down on that low end to differentiate from easy to really easy.
Yeah, I think as we talked about with the examples of especially really well-trained athletes, that the zone 2 training can be quite hard. So in that example, it's useful to have a zone 1 that you can prescribe. Of course, you can also prescribe in different ways, like just really chill or shuffle or however you want to prescribe. But
sure.
But I think that makes sense to separate those two. I think a lot of people are used to 5-zone systems, and in that a lot of these zones would have, between the 2 thresholds, they would have a zone 3 and a zone 4. Zone 4 would basically go up to the second threshold. But as you said, when you get really well trained and get that endurance capacity up really high, you can get really close with the first threshold to the second, and then that becomes a really redundant. So actually, even though I personally use a 5-zone system as well, I do like your use of 4 zones. It makes more sense, to be honest, than 5 zones for that reason. And one thing
let me interject.
Sorry.
Oh, real quickly, I think I understand completely why it would be better in some ways if you can control the intensity. So, like if a runner goes to the track and they're doing 800-meter repeats, and they know what the pace should be, and they can control it. They're using pace as their measure of intensity. Then that's great. You could parse that down into, there's a big difference between, 5 seconds faster or slower in 800 meters. And the same thing could be done on a bicycle with a power meter. But when you're a mountain athlete or a cross-country skier and you're in an undulating terrain and you don't have those kind of metrics and you're forced to use heart rate, it gets kind of silly, like you just said. If the zone 3 is only 8 or 10 beats wide, it's very hard to control that intensity in undulating terrain.
Yeah. One more question, and I actually think that we will kind of start to wrap it up after that, because we've been going for a long time, and I feel like we could go on for at least as long still, but we might save that for a follow-up at some point. But the one thing that I want to get at is whether for triathletes in this context, that a lot of them have power meters on the bike, and of course GPS watches that can give them pace on the run. Some even have power meters on the run. How would you use different measures of intensity, heart rate, pace, power, in prescription, or just as a general, like, this is what makes more sense to use for athletes? Because I think that heart rate with a lot of athletes is very out of fashion, which I don't think is a great thing, because heart rate is really useful. But yeah, you can give me your thoughts on how you would prescribe things and how you would recommend people using different measures of intensity.
Okay, so I wish that for this type of sports that I coach and have coached, we had a good way of measuring this intensity other than heart rate, because I don't think heart rate it's not an ideal proxy for intensity. But for these kind of sports I coach, it's the best we've got. And so we're kind of forced into using it. And, I think if you have other ways of measuring intensity, like running pace or power on a bicycle, I would gravitate to those in a minute. Because then they're going to be, if you're training for a sport like triathlon, same thing when swimming, you can develop your aerobic threshold pace, your anaerobic threshold pace. I mean, Albrecht's book is full of examples of how he used that stuff with coaching swimmers. And the same could be said for running. You can use pace as a very accurate measure of intensity in that case. And then cycling, same thing with power. So I think in training for a sport like triathlon, the ideal thing to do would be to have determine these thresholds, these intensity zones for each different sport using one of these testing methods that we've talked about. And then when you're training for that sport, you would naturally use those zones. But I don't have, firsthand real world experience with coaching triathletes. So that's about the best I could say about it. I mean, like I said, I wish we had a better method for the kind of sports I end up working with.
Yeah. I mean, there are some prototypes, I think, for ski poles with power meters, but I'm not sure whether they're commercialized and how well they function. I think one thing that I think is an advantage of using heart rate is that the heart rate zones would stay, at least in an athlete, where you expect to see some good development and improvement in endurance capacity. The heart rate zones can still stay relatively the same for longer than pace or power zones, so they remain relevant for much longer. That being said, you gave some examples of the heart rate at the lactate threshold 1 increasing by a lot, and that's actually something that was quite interesting for me to hear, because definitely that's the kind of change that you mentioned. I can't remember how much you said, but that I wouldn't have expected to happen in terms of heart rate. Of course, the pace and the power, but heart rate, that was quite interesting to hear. But that's been one reason that I like to use heart rate for low intensity training or even RPE, because I think a lot of at least quite experienced athletes are really good at self-regulating if you give them a verbal description or an RPE number to follow. And I tend to then use power and pace for moderate to high intensity when you want to, for example, do something at race pace. Then of course you're going to run a certain pace, not a certain heart rate, if you want to train for that, to be able to run, let's say, a 1:30 half marathon off the bike or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, there are many different ways to go about these things, of course, and it is a blessing for triathletes to have the option of using multiple different measures, and a great deal of power comes from being able to combine them, as you do with your heart rate drift tests that uses both pace and heart rate, or power and heart rate if you're doing it on the bike. So using them all in a smart combination, I think, is probably the best.
And I do think that you just pointed out that RPE, or your perception of effort, is a really important thing to understand. And athletes shouldn't become overly data driven. I think of all this great data that we can now collect with heart rates and GPS and that sort of thing. It's a wonderful tool to have, but in the end, I think it's also really important. Like what I like to do with athletes I coach is I look at the data that they upload into Training Peaks, but with just as much interest, if not more, I read their comments about how they felt. And so I'm knowing, yes, it's great to know that you ran this many kilometers and you did this much vertical, and your heart rate stayed in this zone, but how did that feel to you? Are you still carrying fatigue from something we did 2 days ago? That would be a big red flag for me and say, okay, we need to start thinking about adjusting the training here. And I think if the self-coached athlete needs to have that same careful perception of the training effect that the training is having on them. And I'm sure you know who Renato Canova is. Canova is one of, I'm a huge fan of his and his training methodologies. But one of the things that he says is training is not the work you do, it's the effect that work has on you. And so it's important not to just be a slave to the training plan and to be able to ascertain, okay, is my training going in the right direction here? Yeah, I'm doing the workouts, but are they having the effect that I'm looking for?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Canova is known for just cutting all the training for a couple of days from his runners if they don't respond in the way that he wants, and just appreciating the importance of rest in the dose response relationship and how that's as much of a component, which is something that we had on the list of questions to discuss as well, recovery, but we didn't get to. I think we'll start to wrap up here, but with the rapid fire questions. But it's been really great to have this in-depth discussion, and I really hope we can continue with some of the questions we didn't get to at a later point. But let's move on to the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
2, both of them by Yuri Verkhoshansky. One of them that sounds counterintuitive is the Special Strength Training Manual for Coaches. Chapter 7 in that book will open your eyes to some really interesting ideas about training for strength, training for endurance. The other is also by Yuri Verkhoshansky, and that is called The Block Training System for Distance Runners. Those two have been incredibly influential on my thinking about how to train, how to coach.
Are they easily available?
Yes, they're both available off of Amazon. They're available also from, if you go to, I can send you the proper spelling, but Yuri Verkhoshansky's, he's dead now, but his daughter runs a website where she sells his writings. And we don't have time to go into it, why he's such an important figure, but trust me, he is. And he's a lot of what we know about training now. He's ex-Soviet. He was a Soviet scientist and Soviet coach. Came from him, believe it or not. So yeah, they are available, and I will send you some links after we get off our talk here.
Great. And what's an important habit that you have benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Skepticism and curiosity.
And finally, who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
Oh gosh, there's so many people that I've been inspired by and looked up to, that, I'm not sure I have one that I could say, but I think that maybe one of the most inspirational sports characters that I can think of immediately is David Rudisha, the world record holder in the 800 meters.
Yeah, that's a good call. Really good. And finally, tell the listeners, where can they follow you and Uphill Athlete and find out more about what's going on over there?
Well, I don't have any presence on social media. I'm too technologically inept to handle it and too busy with other stuff. So but you can find out more about what we do at uphillathlete.com. We have over 300 articles on the website about training. and related activities. Also, we have a huge video library. We do podcasts on our channel as well. And so I think there's a lot of resources there that are free and open. We're trying to disseminate this information to as many people as we can for free. So there's no charge for any of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I read or skimmed through a lot of articles actually in preparation for this interview, and I have to say there are very few resources for blog style information on endurance training directed to that is like that any athlete, recreational endurance athlete, can consume that I would consider good quality. But what you're doing is excellent, really, really, really high quality. So highly recommend people check out the blog, and I also look forward to giving the podcast a listen. I haven't listened to that yet, but we'll do that shortly.
Well, thank you very much.
And finally, no problem. Thank you so much for coming on. As I said, I think we could have gone on for at least as long, and I do hope that we have a chance to do a follow-up in the future and get to some other questions that we didn't get to today.
Yeah, I think we are kind of kindred souls in our interest in I'm fascinated by the science behind all this, but I'm also very passionate about the art of coaching, the art of training, which I think trying to bring those two things together. But again, Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful, and I would look forward to a return visit at some point if that works out for you.
Okay, great. Until then, take care, Scott.
All right.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with plenty of links to related articles on the Uphill Athlete website, like the heart rate drift test instructions, how to set your training zones according to what Scott described, and a training zones heart rate calculator. Also, of course, we'll link to Scott's books and website, YouTube, and Instagram, or Uphill Athlete social media, that is. I also linked to some previous episodes on the Triathlon Show, Steven Seiler and Jan Olbrecht that we mentioned in this episode, as well as the book by Jan Olbrecht, which is available on Kindle. If you like to read in that format, that's how I've read the book, through the Kindle version, as well as the website where you can buy Professor Yuri Verkhoshansky's books that Scott mentioned as being his favorite resource. Now, if you're interested in taking your training to the next level, then consider getting help from a professional coach or using a good quality training plan. You can check out the options that we have to offer on scientifictriathlon.com, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have questions or want to learn more. Also, another note that I want to make is that I was recently a guest on the Train Right podcast in episode 86. We were talking about things like base training and periodization, among others. So if you want to hear somebody else ask me a bunch of questions about how I work, the way that I tend to do on this podcast with the people I interview, then that's a really great episode to listen to. We cover some really interesting topics that hopefully you will learn something from. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free online sweat test and quick carb calculator to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs and individualize your plan. And book a free video consultation with the team to refine your strategy. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.